In 1992, when toy sales started cooling down, the then president of the US branch of Playmates Toys, Richard Salas, predicted that the brand only needed to survive another 5 years to become an evergreen classic like G.I. Joe or Barbie. But the slow decline of Turtlemania proved too stressful for its creators, and midway through the 90s, Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird considered selling the property. Without a solid offer though, the creative duo decided to stick to the Turtles. By the end of the 90s, the franchise was almost non-existent, and its creators were no longer talking to each other. To complicate things further, Peter Laird had been burned out by the business side of Turtlemania. But thanks to the timely intervention of some fans, Peter emerged from his burnout and decided to prove that the franchise was truly evergreen, not a fad. Of course, Turtlemania was a marketing-friendly interpretation of his creation. So, would Peter be able to bring back the Turtles in a way that could be truthful to the original? Or would he end up breaking the Greenback's machine? Join me today for the 6th episode of History in a Half Shell, and what I had to call the Revival. Before I dive into this episode, I recommend you read Andrew Farago's book, TMNT, The Ultimate Visual History. It's been a valuable source for these videos. Now, let's get back to our history series. Things had changed from the early days of Turtlemania. Mirage Studios had a CEO, Gary Richardson, who could help handle the business side of the franchise. With this in mind, Mirage Licensing Inc. assumed responsibility for all licensing rights to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in April 2000, taking them from Surge Licensing and Mark Friedman. In Gary's words, while Surge was one of the best agents in the business, they felt like bringing the property back in-house to continue marketing and licensing the Turtles, nurture the property, and evaluate creative options. But Surge wasn't the only player involved with the franchise. Kevin Eastman still had an ownership interest in the property and the company. So, after some intense negotiations, Peter purchased Kevin's ownership interest in the Turtles and Mirage in June of 2000. However, Kevin wasn't entirely out of the picture yet. He kept a small profit participation interest in the exploitation of the Turtles, which he would hold for a few more years. More on that later. For Kevin, the sale was an opportunity to move on to other projects, like the Heavy Metal 2000 animated movie. After 15 years with the Turtles, Kevin was happy at Heavy Metal, and it didn't seem at the time that the Turtles were going anywhere anytime soon. Now as a sole owner, Peter was looking to relaunch the Turtles closer to his vision, weekly on a national TV network. Something easier said than done. While the franchise was still dead in terms of output, the comics side of things was in transition. A Casey Jones story titled Muscle and Faith was initially intended to come out in the mid-90s, but got cancelled when Mirage stopped publishing comics in 1995. Its creator, Jeff Bonnevert, who had worked for Kevin in Tundra Publishing, got the story released weekly and digitally through FlyingColorsComics.com. 6 new pages were released for 12 weeks, and to this day, it hasn't been officially printed. Through Zeromayo Studios, Peter, Jim Lawson, and Michael Dooney delivered the last graphic novel for the Planet Racers saga. Then, Peter, Jim, and Eric Talbot began work on a new TMNT volume, with covers painted by Michael Dooney. This volume, commonly known as Volume 4, kicked off in March. But Peter had some heavy decisions to make before taking on a direction. The TMNT comics had gone in unpredictable directions that just didn't fit within the ideas that Kevin and Peter had. So, to figure out what was canon and what wasn't for Volume 4, Peter decided to leave out most of the guest era and Volume 3. This ruffled some feathers. The most loyal fans were expecting Peter to continue the story started at Image Comics. But Peter couldn't pick up where Gary Carlson left off with the Turtles, and he decided to let that team finish the story at some point in the future. As for the guest era stories, some of them couldn't be reprinted due to the nature of the informal contracts at the time. So, except for a few adventures made by Mirage staffers, they were removed from canon from that point forward. Without Kevin, Peter also had creative freedom to tell the stories he wanted to tell with the Turtles. It also meant that Peter had the power to correct mistakes, such as Michelangelo's name, which would be spelled correctly from then on. Without Kevin's involvement, though, it was impossible to recapture the essence of Volume 1. And with that in mind, Peter decided to go in a different direction, more attuned to his own sensitivities. While he didn't have a long-term vision for the series, he wanted to tell a serialized story, separating the Turtles and aging them up. He wanted this new era to have a pacing closer to real life, without clean beginnings and endings and overlapping events. The new bi-monthly run debuted in December 2001, and its first issue was successful enough to have a second printing. Growing tired of the Turtles having to stick to the shadows, Peter normalized their existence by introducing alien races that could live side by side with humans. This change would end up inspiring future adaptations. Peter continued using duo shades for the book's tones throughout its first 8 issues, but he later learned how to do them in Photoshop over his inked pages. He would also letter his pages digitally on his Mac. He initially inked, but soon realized he wasn't as fast as he used to be, and Eric stepped in as inker. The next priority was to take the Turtles to the small and the big screen. But this would prove to be a road filled with challenges. Rainbow Studios attempted to make a CGI show in 2001. Only a short concept pilot was created to show around, and it took 3 to 5 months to generate it. No networks were interested in doing a computer-generated show at the time, and the project was scrapped. The big screen, however, looked promising. In June 2001, it was announced that John Woo was working on a new CGI iteration of the Turtles, with a target release date for the holidays of 2002. However, the $40 million to $60 million project had no studio attached to co-finance or distribute it. By the end of 2001, a new possibility to launch an animated series on Kids WB came up. It would have involved the team behind Batman Beyond, and many concept designs were created. According to NinjaTurtles.com, the show would have aired on the WB or Cartoon Network. Unfortunately, Warner Bros. Passed on the project because they wanted a funnier show. Perhaps animation wasn't the right choice at the time, and an agreement was made for a hybrid CGI live-action miniseries from Hallmark Entertainment, with a target release date for 2003 or 2004. You may be wondering how the Hallmark Channel ended up entertaining the idea of a Ninja Turtles miniseries, and the answer lies in a link to the past. Steve Barron, the director of the first live-action movie, had worked with Hallmark on his 1998 Merlin miniseries, which aired on NBC. This project, though, was likely to debut on the Hallmark Channel. At the time, the miniseries was supposed to come out right between the release of the new animated series and before the John Woo movie, marking a progression in scale for the Turtles to take over the world again. Brendan McCarthy, who worked on storyboards for the first movie, contributed concept designs to this project. The Turtles and Splinter would have been made partially or fully in CGI, but mostly performed by real actors in suits. There was even some test footage of Splinter fighting on location. Since the show would have been directed by Steve Barron, the story would have been a sequel to the first movie, ignoring the events of the 2 sequels. Little is known about the miniseries plot. Given the nature of the internet, there are more unverified rumors than known facts, fueled mainly by concept designs that depicted the Turtles in street clothes, fighting ninjas, and fighting a 5th Dark Turtle in armor. It was also implied that there was something more to the Turtles' origin than was previously known, and the story would have been a cross between Men in Black, The Matrix, and Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Thanks to Peter's blog, we eventually learned about a proposed creature called Shreddit, and that, in the movie's climax, the Turtles would have been able to merge into one turtle spirit. Given the business relationship between Peter and Steve, the idea of releasing a director's cut of the first live-action movie resurfaced again, but never materialized. But, as I said, the animated series failed to launch, putting everything else in danger. By mid-2002, the CGI movie was still happening, with Digital Rim Entertainment joining the project. Unfortunately, by October 2002, the John Woo project was abandoned due to lack of interest. Despite all the adaptation setbacks, stars were starting to align for Mirage in 2002. 6 issues of Volume 4 were published, including the return of Gizmo for a short backup story by Michael Dooney. Dan Berger released a 3-issue Gutwallow miniseries through Digital Webbing, which he worked on with edits and letters by Peter Laird. The story was a reflection of the time. Dan wanted to channel all that negativity from the recent terrorist attacks into something positive and fun. Another star that aligned was Steve Murphy's return to comics. He was working with Eric Talbot on a limited miniseries for that fall. While I don't think this story ever got published, it brought Steve back to the Turtles' orbit. Outside of Mirage, Kevin Eastman released his autobiography through Heavy Metal. Kevin would continue releasing comics throughout the decade, often in partnership with Simon Bisley. Things were changing on the small screen. In October 2001, Saban sold Fox Family Worldwide to Walt Disney Co. for $2.9 billion in cash and the assumption of $2.3 billion in Fox Family debt. Included in the sale was the Saban catalog, which included The Next Mutation. Without the catalog, the Fox Kids Network programming block ended in September 2002. Programming was then leased to 4Kids Entertainment, which at the time had a long history of localizing overseas animation for the US market, with recent successes such as Pokemon, Sonic X, One Piece, and Yu-Gi-Oh! This was how the Fox Kids block was replaced with the Fox Box. With this opportunity for expansion, 4Kids was looking for a property to develop from scratch. After hearing about the failed launch of a TMNT cartoon on the WB network, 4Kids began considering pitching their own version. One of the creative directors behind the new Fox Box, Lloyd Goldfine, expressed his interest in pitching a new TMNT cartoon with 4Kids president Norman Grossfeld. Norman then set up a meeting with Peter and Gary at Mirage. Lloyd and Norman knew about the Warner Bros. Pitch. They knew they wanted to turn April and Casey into high schoolers, which, at the time, was a significant departure from the source material. This influenced Lloyd to pitch a more faithful adaptation of the original comics. That was a proposal Peter couldn't refuse. Apart from the first movie, the comic books were hardly explored by the adaptations up to that point, and Lloyd believed they could capture their spirit without making it for adults. Not only that, Peter would also have complete creative control in terms of approval rights, which was one of the things that Peter didn't completely have over the original cartoon. He agreed to the deal and would keep close communications with Lloyd, who would be the initial head writer for the show. Peter would approve scripts, designs, and concepts directly with Lloyd, who in turn would deal with the creative team behind the show, keeping the two worlds separate. Another reason this idea was so appealing to Peter was that 4Kids and Mirage were direct partners, unlike the Fred Wolf cartoon, which was made through Surge licensing. This ensured that the show couldn't deviate from Peter's vision. This, of course, resulted in a cartoon that avoided going into the mutant of the week territory. And since 4Kids had experience with anime like Yu-Gi-Oh!, they knew that the serialized format was already working well for them. This was yet another departure from the previous shows, becoming the first heavily serialized TMNT cartoon, allowing for full-fleshed character arcs and growth. This format was generally avoided by the networks because it made reruns harder to schedule, but since 4Kids was producing and airing the show, they could take the risk. By May 2002, the show was announced for an early 2003 release. Unfortunately, 4Kids was putting the cart before the horse. By October 2002, the show was nowhere near ready to start animation and had yet to develop an artistic direction. Knowing that they needed an industry veteran, they brought in Chuck Patton to direct the show. He had an extensive career working on shows such as Spawn and the DC animated universe, as well as comic books. Chuck assembled a crew to produce the show from the 4Kids offices in New York, which was a challenge in itself, as most of the talent resided on the other side of the country. With only a couple of months left to ship the first episode, Chuck drew inspiration from the first movie for the Turtles and the show's tone. He proposed it be closer to live-action martial arts, emphasizing the ninja aspect of the property, rather than the mutant part. He came up with the turtle designs, collaborating with initial character designer Ajit Jyotikumar, who would later be replaced by Adrian Barrios. Other visual inspirations for the show were the Batman animated series for its cinematic staging, Ninja Scroll for its shadow work and martial arts realism, and Shaw Brothers and Sonny Chiba films for their fighting styles. It's also very likely that Chuck co-designed the modern Foot Clan logo. One of the storyboard artists was Roy Burdine, who would later take on a more important role in the show. The show was animated in South Korea by Dongwoo Animation. The noir-inspired palette of the show was developed and maintained by Dancing Diablo. Since Dongwoo had an initial stake in the show, they had influence in artistic decisions as well. This abundance of stakeholders maintained a creative balance, preventing Playmates from exerting too much control over the show. Because, don't forget, advertising money wasn't as strong as it was in the 80s, and the show relied on merchandising sales to stay on the air. Before moving to casting, the show needed to develop its rogues gallery. They wanted to ensure there were stakes by avoiding the silly or funny villains of the original cartoon. But what about the Shredder? Well, Peter didn't feel like using him anymore. The Fred Wolf cartoon had used the character ad nauseum during the Turtlemania years, and it was hard to take him seriously anymore. To Lloyd, not using the Shredder would have been a mistake. The show was aimed at a new generation, unfamiliar with the character. So Lloyd and Peter agreed they would include the character, but they would keep reinventing him throughout the series, adding new pieces to the overall puzzle that was the Shredder. With this in mind, they took their time introducing him, with a whole backstory left unexplored until the second season. This was one of the most notorious deviations from the original cartoon. The Shredder wasn't simply a Rokusaki, he was an Utrum, a twist that Peter was super excited about. Susan Blue, cast director of the Fred Wolf cartoon, returned to direct the new cast, something she would end up doing remotely, only flying to New York for the first few episodes. For the auditions, the actors were asked to imitate the voices of the 1990 movie cast, especially Corey Feldman's Donatello. Michael Sinterniklaas showed up uninvited based on a friend's recommendation. After reading for multiple Turtles, he was surprised to have landed Leo, as he considered it his weakest performance. This made him feel miscast during the first season, and led him to constantly worry that he would be replaced. What he didn't know was that he had been handpicked by Peter Laird, even though they didn't know where he came from. Raphael was voiced by Greg Abbey, who was usually credited as Frank Frankson. Many actors in the show worked under pseudonyms because it was non-union, and they wouldn't have been able to work on it otherwise. Wayne Grayson, whose real name was Vinnie Penna Jr., voiced Michelangelo, and Donnie was played by Sam Riegel. The cast recorded their lines together, which also led to some improvisation. This was allowed because the voices were recorded before doing the animation. Interestingly, the actors also resembled their characters. Michael would usually try to keep the rest of the cast from getting too chaotic. Wayne and Greg would goof around, and Sam would do crosswords in his booth. Sam would also sometimes record remotely from LA. Darren Dunstan played Master Splinter and oversaw the ADR mix. Veronica Taylor, the actress who voiced Ash Ketchum for Pokemon, played April, and Mark Thompson played Casey Jones. Finally, the Shredder was played by Scotty Ray, whose deep voice immediately distinguished this version of the character as something that escaped from Nightmare Land. Rich Underberg, who initially designed some licensing materials for the cartoon, also designed the new logo that would be used for the show, toys, and all the merchandising for the rest of the decade. Other licensing artists included Carrie Randolph, who would go on to work on some of the most iconic marketing designs and work closely with Michael Dooney, Lawrence Christmas, and Emilio Lopez. The new theme song was performed by Norman Grossfeld and Russell Velasquez. The song would go through slight variations throughout the first 5 seasons. A mini-comic was made by Michael Dooney for Toys R Us as a promotion for the new cartoon, including promotional items for other shows in the Fox Box block. This was the first time animated turtles had no pupils, which seemed off to casual fans who weren't familiar with the comics. Playmates Toys produced the new action figures and shipped them in December, so they would be available by the time the cartoon debuted in 2003. Retail sales activities in the weeks leading up to the debut exceeded both management and trade expectations. Turtlemania was a marketing phenomenon that, due to changes in the entertainment industry, couldn't be replicated. With this in mind, Peter and Gary's approach to this new era was more conservative. The goal was to maintain control over the brand and preserve Mirage's creative autonomy. Issues 8 to 13 of Volume 4 came out in 2003, which included the death of a classic character. But the book was starting to get on some readers' nerves. They were expecting more action and a more compressed storytelling style, which Peter simply wasn't interested in writing at the time. Another share of criticism went to artist Jim Lawson, whose style had changed notoriously over the years, and it was starting to be an acquired taste for some readers. Jim, however, had one of the most recognizable styles in the franchise, which wasn't exclusive to humanoid turtles. He also published Paleo, Tales of the Cretaceous, through Zaramayo Studios and Empty Sky. Jim had been working on this dinosaur 6-issue miniseries anthology since he published Dino Island in 1993. With the cartoon ready to launch, the next step was the 2-part Hallmark movie, which was still scheduled for release in 2004. But progress seemed stalled. Another significant change in licensing was a breakup between Mirage and Random House. The rights to coloring books were given to Steve Levine and Ryan Brown, who returned to the franchise through a small company they created to produce official 4Kids coloring books, Levine Brown Publishing. The books may have not been super profitable, but the quality was much better than the books produced during Turtlemania. Following lessons from Surge, Mirage approached this new era with a multi-channel strategy that included promotions with McDonald's, Burger King, KFC, and Subway. The first season aired from February to November 2003 and introduced new characters to the mythos, including Hun, the Elintians, Nano, Garbage Man, Angel, Silver Sentry, and Dr. Abigail Finn. As a more faithful adaptation of the source material, it also featured classic characters and stories, introducing new versions of Baxter Stockman, the Outrams, and Kirby. Coinciding with the show's release, 4Kids created a new site, www.tmnt.tv, which included cool features like games and freebies, and eventually would include streaming of recent episodes for the US region. The show found initial friction from the fans of the original cartoon, who felt these turtles were too different from their favorite show. Some of them were aware that it was their version of the turtles that was different, but this wasn't common knowledge at the time. Having said that, the show reached a new generation of kids and connected with hardcore fans of the franchise. The show's debut represented a ratings bump for Foxbox, which had been in the red after a year of losing its boys 6 to 11 audience. This problem wasn't unique to the Foxbox. Cartoon Network had also lost 20% in ratings among kids 2 to 11 and 6 to 11, but other networks, like Disney Channel and Nickelodeon, were making acceptable numbers. So, the Turtles were a big success for 4Kids and brought hope for the Foxbox blog, quickly becoming the network's highest-rated show. An obvious merchandise tie-in for a Turtles cartoon was a comic book adaptation. This proved so successful for the previous cartoon that it spawned the longest-running TMNT comic book run up to that point. With that in mind, the license was given to Dreamwave Productions, a Canadian comic book publisher, and legendary writer Peter David was approached to write the book. Since his daughters were big fans of the Turtles, Peter David agreed to do it, but with a twist. Initially, the book adapted episodes of the cartoon, but with a spin. Instead of focusing on the 4 Turtles, Peter told those stories from a different perspective. This decision was understandable, as straight-up adapting the episodes would have been a little boring. The book had a noticeable, unique style, thanks to newcomer artist LaShawn Thomas and inkers Eric Sander and Rob Armstrong. The book followed the show for 4 issues, and started telling its own stories with issue 5. After 7 issues, an 8th was announced, but was never published. It would have introduced an evil turtlebot named T4, the Turtlemator. Unfortunately, Dreamwave wasn't doing well financially, and the company ceased operations shortly after. The Canadian publisher, which was popular for its Transformers license, collapsed in the midst of what they called a shrinking comic book market, and diminishing sales made it impossible for the independent publisher to continue. The license reverted back to Mirage licensing, but the publisher was already busy publishing another book. More on that later. Right after the end of Season 1, 4Kids released a second season of the cartoon that aired from November 2003 to October 2004. This season introduced the Battle Nexus, where the Turtles and their master competed in the Big Brawl, an interdimensional tournament. This was the perfect excuse to bring in another Turtles-adjacent property, Usagi Yojimbo, in a much more faithful adaptation of the character. In those episodes, it was explored that Michelangelo was the most natural martial artist of the pack. However, Mikey's natural talent was usually overshadowed by his insecurity, which required support from others. The season had Mike Ryan as showrunner, with Chuck Patton still directing. Other introductions this year included the Ultimate Ninja, the Daimyo of the Battle Nexus, and Draco. Apart from Usagi Yojimbo, other classic characters reintroduced this season included the Triceratons, the Fugitoid, Leatherhead, the Justice Force, and Karai. The Playmates action figures began appearing at retail in January 2003, just before the show's premiere. Unlike the previous toy line, these figures were sculpted in China, the company's home base. To promote the series and the toy line, a TV sourcebook was released through Toys R Us, which included Fleer trading cards in advance of their April release. The book also promoted the 4 Turtles, Shredder, Foot Soldier, Battle Shell, Sewer Slider, and Shell Cycle releases by Playmates. The comic was illustrated by Michael Dooney, Dan Berger, Dario Brizuela, and Eric Talbot, with a design by A.C. Farley. Some other notable releases this year included April, Casey, Hun, Foot Tech Ninja, Foot Elite Guard, and Foot Gunner. An impressive Turtle Lair playset was also released this year. Among the variants in 2003 were Extreme Sports, Giant Turtles, minifigures, fighting gear, and more. Business-wide, the toy line was a success in expanding back into the boys' market, perhaps thanks to the cartoon's edgier tone. With the successful introduction of 2 new brands, Playmates doubled toy sales in 2003. Sales for TMNT in particular exceeded all initial expectations. By the end of the year, TMNT ranked among the best-selling boys' toys, and it was among the top 3 boys' action figure brands in the UK, France, Australia, and Canada. This, of course, was supported by the show debuting in 15 international markets. In the US, 40 licensees were appointed to cover all key non-toy products, like video games by Konami and home video by Funimation. This included cross-promotion in Burger King. I'll talk about Konami later in this video. TMNT Volume 4 continued its regular bi-monthly publication with issues 14 to 19 this year, but a new book from Mirage would steal most of the attention. To ensure a TMNT book out every month, a new volume of Tales of the TMNT was created. While Peter was still the editor-in-chief, the book was worked mainly by veterans and new artists under the direction of the book's editor, Steve Murphy. The new book gave Dan Berger, Steve Murphy, Jim Lawson, Eric Talbot, and Ryan Brown a chance to officially work on the Turtles again. The book opened with a story by Murphy and artist Dario Brizuela, who was hired by Murphy via Mike Hawthorne. Dario worked remotely from Argentina and never met Murphy in person. He would be one of the recurring artists in the book and would eventually take on the 2012 animated series comic book. More on that in the next chapter in this playlist. The way the book was run involved Mirage staffers pitching synopses to Peter, who would then pick up the ones he was interested in. The book came out bi-monthly at first, to cover the months skipped by Volume 4. In January 2004, Foxbox was rebranded as 4Kids TV, but it wouldn't be the only significant change taking place this year. The show expanded to weekdays on the Cartoon Network, premiering episodes there and on 4Kids TV for the following 2 years. The third season aired from October 2004 to April 2005, with some changes taking place behind the scenes. Chuck Padden, who was essential to the series' launch, left the show and was replaced by artist Roy Burdine as supervising director. Roy, a huge fan of the original comics, had been working on the show as a storyboard artist in previous seasons. Chuck's departure from the show was due to burnout and creative differences with 4Kids Entertainment. Freelance writer Christopher Yost joined the franchise, recommended by writer Greg Johnson to showrunner Mike Ryan. It was thanks to Yost that we got most of the character development for a brand new character, Agent Bishop. In fact, Bishop and the EPF were a necessary innovation for the show, as the Shredder saga was reaching its conclusion and new enemies needed to be introduced. Roy Burdine also contributed to the character's backstory. Apart from Bishop, the season introduced other characters, such as Dr. Chaplin and Touch and Go. It also adapted classic characters like Clunk, Mr. Marlin, Nobody, Renette, Savanti Romero, the Super Turtles, Planet Racers, and the Rat King, although not by name yet. One memorable episode this season was Same as It Never Was, a sort of dystopian future story in which the Turtles failed to stop the Shredder from taking over the city. The action figure line continued to perform strongly in 2004, with new releases such as the Toddler Turtles, Leatherhead, the Footfire Mystic, Silver Sentry, Fugitoid, Outram, Commander Mozart, Baxter Stockman, Usagi Yojimbo, and the Ultimate Daimyo. A key tie-in wave this year was centered around the Battle Nexus. Some vehicles included the Turtle Tunneler and the Shell Sub. Toy sales grew by 36%, with a 29% increase in the US and 67% increase internationally over 2003. Despite continued US retail consolidation and an overall decline in toy sales, Playmates Toys was among the fastest growing toy companies in the US. This increase was also attributed to their partnerships with 4Kids, Disney, Cartoon Network, and Nickelodeon. Retail consolidation in the US had been underway since the late 90s and was considered to have peaked in 2004. Big chains began acquiring smaller retailers, which in turn led to stiffer competition. Walmart, for example, had overtaken Toys R Us as the #1 toy retailer in the US by 1999. FAO Schwarz filed for bankruptcy in late 2003, followed by KB Toys in early 2004. By mid-2004, Toys R Us was up for sale. With the disappearance of smaller retailers, it's estimated that 80% of the toy sales in 2004 came from Walmart, Target, and Toys R Us. TMNT had grown 55% worldwide, expanding into over 45 countries. It continued ranking among the best-selling action figure brands, finishing the year in the top 3 in the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia. This expansion was expected to reach Spain and Italy in early 2005. But Playmates Toys wasn't the only player in Hong Kong. Thomas Gray, producer of the original trilogy of live-action movies, was now working for Imaji Animation Studios. When he joined the company, they realized he had history with the franchise and asked him if he wanted to work with the Turtles again. Tom knew that doing a live-action movie was very expensive, so going the CG route was probably the best option to bring the Turtles to the big screen. Tom then got in contact with Peter Laird in Mirage, and with the Hallmark project seemingly dead, he managed to get the rights to produce a new animated film. Work on the new movie began in the summer of 2005 under the direction and writing of Kevin Munro. His take was a more action-oriented, less Cowabunga approach, a vision he communicated to producer Galen Walker, who then arranged for him to meet Peter Laird in Northampton. Kevin Munro suspected he wasn't going to get the approval from Peter, so just in case, he brought his copy of TMNT number 1 for Peter to sign, hoping to at least get something out of it. After the meeting, Kevin opened his copy to check Peter's signature and found a drawing of Raphael with the message, "Dear Kevin, make a good movie, or else." This was how he found out he was in. Several ideas were floated for the film, including an outer space adventure featuring Triceratons and other space villains. But Kevin eventually narrowed his focus on the family theme. Initial development on the film took place at Imaji's LA studio, with most of the animation done in Hong Kong, before being sent to LA for post-production. A treatment and promo were put together to find a distributor, but they were unfortunately met with skepticism. After the success of Spider-Man and the X-Men, the Turtles felt like superheroes that time forgot. Companies were unsure whether the franchise was just for kids or for all ages, given its popularity in cartoons and toy aisles. The movie eventually found a domestic distributor in Warner Brothers and an international distributor in the Weinstein Company. Peter Laird was executive producer on the film, in an attempt to gain greater creative control and avoid the disappointments he suffered with the last 2 films. Munro considered making the movie a continuation of the first live-action film. This was the second time that a movie project tried to continue from that film, and it wasn't unusual at all. Superman Returns was going in a similar direction by continuing from the second movie. By following the events of the first one, Kevin wanted to avoid a complete reboot that would require retelling the same story. The idea was supported by Peter, but eventually rejected by Warner and the Weinstein Company, who preferred a clean reboot. As a result of this disagreement, the film exists as some sort of soft reboot. It's a spin-off universe from the 1990 film that still stands on its own. Being seen as a continuation meant they didn't need to use the Shredder. However, finding early stories to adapt became a minefield, as most had already been adapted in one way or another by previous projects. They settled on a new villain and introduced Karai as a setup to bring the Shredder back in a sequel. This was also Karai's debut on the silver screen. While Warner Brothers did some meddling in the later phases of the project, most of the production went unnoticed, giving them enough freedom to tell their story. Volume 4 continued with its schedule for another year, printing issues 20 to 25. However, 2005 was a busy year for Mirage in general. Peter remastered the first issue of Volume 1 with new digital toning, dialogue corrections, and new lettering. His idea was to correct typos and showcase the ink work a little better, which was muddied by the duo shades in the original printing. He had good intentions, but some fans saw this as an attempt to remove Kevin Eastman from that story, something that wasn't really possible, as they completed each other's work. Adding to Peter's worries was the book's poor sales. He revealed that after the first issue, Volume 4 never made a profit again. Mirage was printing 4,000 copies per issue at the time, and the cost of producing them exceeded revenue. The only reason the book was still being published was that it was his passion project. Getting a little stressed by the constant demands of the franchise, Peter even hinted at moving to an annual schedule so he could take a break. On the other hand, Tales of the TMNT went monthly, publishing issues 7 to 18 this year. Finally, on the other side of the world, the Turtles found their way back into the Italian magazine Il Giornalino, with brand new stories set in the 4Kids universe for a few years. The fourth season of the cartoon aired from September 2005 to April 2006, and introduced new characters to the lore, such as the Ancient One, Yukio Mishimi, and the Ninja Tribunal. Classic characters like Cousin Sid, Jana, and Robin O'Neill made the jump to the cartoon as well. With the Shredder gone, most of the attention moved to other characters like Karai, who took over the clan, Agent Bishop, who accidentally created a mutant breakout, and Hun, who had learned enough from his former master to run the Purple Dragons like a criminal organization. The season's showrunner was still Michael Ryan, with character designs by Adrian Barrios and Robert Bandel. This season's known for its improved color and lighting quality, but it's also infamously known for an episode, Insane in the Membrane, that had to be taken off the air for being too gruesome. This raised Fox's awareness that the show needed more supervision, and would result in another episode being scrapped the following season. More on that later. 2005 was still a good year for the franchise. New releases this year included Gen, Hamato Yoshi, Feudal Shredder, and Karai. Some figures also included DVDs, including single episodes, a necessary marketing gimmick for a complicated year. All the established action figure brands were negatively impacted by the launch of competitive product lines based on major feature film franchises that dominated the category. Despite this decline in sales, TMNT remained among the top 5 best-selling boys properties in the US, Spain, Scandinavia, Australia, and Canada. It also finished the year among the leaders in action figures in Germany. Volume 4 saw only 3 issues go to print in 2006, leading to a long hiatus until 2008. Issue number 28 would end up being the last easy-to-find issue of the run, for reasons I'll explore later. The long break was caused by Peter feeling burned out from managing the franchise. Peter's attention to the Tales book also dwindled. As a result, he approved some stories this year that he later had no recollection of. Among these were some of the tales taking place in the potential future of the Mirage universe's timeline. Tales of the TMNT was going through an impressive year. A 4-issue Leonardo spin-off miniseries by Lawson saw print, and Tales began getting collected, albeit not in chronological order. Starting with issue number 21, the Turtles began a saga of team-ups with the Wild West Cowboys of Moo Mesa. But there was even more comic book news this year, apart from the main books. Steve Murphy published a 3-issue miniseries through Image Comics titled Umbra, which he did with Mike Hawthorne. It was a story about a forensic scientist investigating a mystery involving the skeleton of a Neanderthal who appeared to have been killed by a Cold War-era Soviet bullet. The story was nominated for 2 Harvey Awards and would later receive a director's cut for the trade paperback. Eric Talbot collaborated with Inks on the first issue. Internationally, the Turtles were still getting reprints. Spanish publisher Norma Editorial acquired the rights to reprint Volume 1, but it quickly ran into problems with material beyond its reach. The forbidden issue in question was the team-up with Cerebus, the best-selling issue Kevin and Peter did with Dave Sim. which introduced Renette and Savanti Romero. For reasons never disclosed, Dave didn't want that story reprinted anymore, leaving Mirage with a problem, as it was the one that introduced two classic characters. To fill the gap, Peter and Steve Murphy tried to come up with a replacement story, which ended up in Jim Lawson's hands for penciling. Steve and Jim came up with a retelling of the first encounter with Renette that didn't undo the original adventure. The new version was published in the second volume of Las Tortugas Ninja in 2007. However, the story wouldn't be used for the American market in reprints because Peter managed to get Dave's approval to reprint the original issue number 8 again. The story titled The Paradox of Chodnovsky would then get picked up and translated by Turtles Club in Russia, publishing it in 2011, 2016, and 2024. The latest versions also included a page that was missing from the Spanish edition. The tale wouldn't be officially published in English until it was included in IDW's Best of Renette special in 2025. The new version had completely new lettering, but lacked the extra epilogue page recovered for the Russian edition. Finally, a special sneak peek comic book was released for San Diego Comic-Con 2006, featuring concept art for the upcoming CGI movie. Things were set up by the end of the 4th season for what would be a shortened last season. The new storyline would revolve around the Ninja Tribunal trying to stop the return of the Tengu Shredder, the original Orokusaki in this universe. It would also conclude the story of Splinter honoring Hamato Yoshi's mission. This premise was a response to Playmates' need to introduce a new wave of variant turtles with mystic powers. Unfortunately, Playmates would change their minds about the show's direction very quickly while the season was in production. Retailers were asking Playmates to shake up the line to bring in new customers and lure back existing ones. Maybe even court the fans of the original cartoon. The culprit of the lack of enthusiasm was, allegedly, the darkness of the show's plots. Many options were discussed among Playmates, 4Kids, and Mirage, including a Western-themed version of the Turtles. In the end, they settled on taking the Turtles 100 years into the future in what we now call Fast Forward. According to Emilio Lopez, Dongwu Animation had a stake in the show early in its run, but later lost interest, leaving Playmates with greater creative control and influence over the cartoon's direction. This wasn't a smooth transition for anyone, as production for a 6th season and a toy line had to be rushed to meet the year's target numbers. With the 5th season no longer a priority, the Lost episodes were produced between Mirage and 4Kids, and the idea was to use them to fill the slot as they produced more fast-forward episodes. The 5th season was aired in various forms from August 2006 to May 2008, initially with some episodes available on demand, with the intention of releasing the whole season on DVD in 2007. As I mentioned earlier, one episode, Nightmares Recycled, was removed from the season. The reason for the outrage from the Fox broadcasting standards and practices was that it introduced the idea that Hun and Garbage Man were conjoined twins surgically separated, with the Garbage Man literally getting thrown away as garbage. It's unclear how far into production it was, but according to a couple of sources behind the show, the script was already recorded, and some animation was already done by the time the decision was made. Here's where the season numbering gets complicated. While it was the 5th season to air, Fast Forward was technically the 6th season, taking place after the events of the Lost season. The show continued from the previous 5 seasons, but introduced a new world, with new supporting characters like Cody Jones and Serling. It was also this season that the show started experimenting with more computer-generated art and backgrounds. Emilio Lopez, who initially worked at 4Kids as an intern before moving to Dancing Diablo as a freelancer doing color design, became the staff color lead as 4Kids began handling coloring in-house. There, he worked with Reggie Butler and Jimmy Tran. However, due to budget cuts, they were forced to simplify the color scheme, unlike previous seasons, where different color palettes were used for various types of lighting. Only the daytime color palette was used throughout the season, regardless of whether it was day or night, indoors or outdoors. Lighting was also simplified compared to the previous seasons. Budget constraints also motivated the team to reuse backgrounds with recolored assets. To compensate for the loss of complexity, Roy Burdine decided to adopt a more angular, Bruce Timm-inspired design aesthetic. Many other new characters were introduced this season, including Darius Dunn, Jammerhead, the Street Phantoms, Shakanabo, Viral, Torben Zix, and the Dark Turtles. Peter's other creation, Planet Racers, was also revisited, and even Ryan Brown's Wild West Cowboys of Moo Mesa made a cameo. The new showrunner was comic book writer Joe Kelly, and the character design was in the hands of Adrian Barrios, who worked closely with Roy Burdine on developing the new characters. Roy also took over voice direction this season. To mark the beginning of a new era, a new theme song by Jake Siegler, Alex Walker, and John Siegler was created to describe the new status quo for the cast. The show continued its syndication run on Cartoon Network, airing in 75 international territories and 20 languages. The season aired from July 2006 to October 2007. Despite the big creative contributions this season brought to the franchise, fans weren't impressed with the changes. The tonal shift was too jarring, and a whole season filled with open plots was skipped to put Fast Forward on the air. The show may have gained and lost viewers, ending up pretty much where it started in merchandising sales. With all the changes going on, most of 2006 was a transition year for Playmates. They had to readjust to Fast Forward while still working on the movie merchandising for the following year. Among the figures released this year were Nobody, Mutated Dawn, Rat King, Quarry, Agent Bishop, and Baxter Robot. TMNT opened on March 23, 2007, and topped the box office with an opening weekend gross of $25 million. It ended up staying in theaters for 91 days, grossing $96 million worldwide. Not bad for a $34 million budget. Apart from the story and direction from Kevin Munro, the movie had main character designs by Jeff Matsuda, Jose Lopez, and Tom Perkins. Simon Merton worked on production design, giving the film its distinct look of wet textures and noir lighting. In fact, the movie was lit like a noir black and white film first, and colors were added later. Giving each turtle a distinct look wasn't exactly groundbreaking in 2007. Even the live-action movies had done that. But it was the first time that the turtles were visually different from each other. Leonardo was given a V shape to make him look more heroic. Raphael was given predatory front-facing eyes because he was the muscle. Michelangelo was given a wider-eyed, innocent look to denote his childish disposition. And Donatello was made more symmetrical and lean, with a larger cranium. The cast included recognizable voices such as Patrick Stewart, Sarah Michelle Gellar, and Chris Evans, but they intentionally chose lesser-known actors for the Turtles to add some authenticity. Unfortunately, Mako Iwamatsu, who voiced Splinter, died of throat cancer before the movie could be completed. His lines were completed by Greg Baldwin, who had also inherited Mako's role in Avatar: The Last Airbender. The film had an original score composed by Marco Beltrami, which was considered too dark, so they replaced it with a new score by composer Klaus Badelt. The movie also had a timely soundtrack that included bands like Gym Class Heroes, Jet, Cobra Starship, POD, and Big City Rock, among others. Despite being an animated movie, TMNT had an alternate opening and ending, and at least one deleted scene that were included for the home video release as special features. These edits were made to achieve a faster, more consistent pacing. Despite its initial box office success and an A- cinema score, the movie received mixed reviews. Critics were not impressed, and fans of the previous films didn't care for the more serious tone and lack of recognizable characters. This was something that Mirage knew could happen. They could have made an artistic integrity trade-off to reach a broader market audience, but the memories of the last two sequels were still too fresh to go in that direction again. The movie had to stay close to the tone of the books. And it's not like they were being naive. Comic book movies were starting to go in that trend, thanks to films like Sin City, Hellboy, and Batman Begins. Nevertheless, at least the film reached kids and adults. While the movie made a profit, there were too many partners involved, so profits were minimal. Munro was supposed to write the sequel, with an option to direct. The return of the Shredder was a possible plot element, and it would have led to a third movie based on City at War. In it, Mikey would have joined Karai and the Foot Clan, wearing a black headband in Japan, and would have returned to New York for the third act. Since Leo and Raph were at the center of the 2007 film, the sequel would have centered around Donnie and Mikey. Unfortunately, Imagi faced financial struggles after Astro Boy underperformed in 2009. Although by then, plans for a live-action movie were already underway. To coincide with the film, Mirage released 5 prequel comics with interconnected covers, telling stories with Raph, Mikey, Donnie, April, and Leo. These were produced in conjunction with Kevin Munro and Peter Laird, which means they were canon to the film. These stories were also broken into installments, recolored, and published as features inside the TMNT comic magazine in the UK. And as was tradition at the time, there was also a movie adaptation. Those 6 issues dedicated to the film's universe compensated for the lack of Volume 4 chapters released in 2007. Peter was burned out and felt it had been a long time since he had been able to enjoy writing and spend time with his family. Fortunately, Tales had another strong year. The Turtles and the Cowboys continued crossing over in issue number 32, and Raphael received his spin-off 4-issue miniseries with Bill Melage, Jim Lawson, and Eric Talbot. Artist Sophie Campbell got in contact with Steve Murphy, who found a way for her to do some covers for the miniseries and the occasional frontispiece for Tales. However, things were about to change. Steve Murphy, tired of chasing artists to deliver on time, decided to step away from the editor role. Seeing how the 25th anniversary was on the horizon, he decided to move on to licensing to organize a special celebration. In his place, Dan Berger stepped in as editor of Tales. Managing freelancers to keep the book on a monthly basis was hard. It would sometimes take a full year to complete an issue of Tales. Mirage creators had priority when pitching stories, and outside freelancers came second. However, because he needed a constant flow of stories, Dan ended up submitting most of the synopses, which is why he wrote so many issues himself. This would also explain why so many issues were written by Steve before. Mirage also published a Treasury edition of Tales Volume 1, with a new Jim Lawson story replacing the frontispieces throughout the book. This never reprinted story, while technically not canon, tied up some loose ends regarding the future of the Mirage timeline. As I mentioned earlier, the TMNT comic magazine published by Titan in the UK included color reprints of the movie prequels, as well as original stories based on the Fast Forward season. It also featured at least one recolored tale of the TMNT. Fast Forward aired during most of 2007, but a follow-up season was already in pre-production. This was the original Season 7, and it would have continued the plots from the previous season, exploring more stories with Baxter Stockman, the Dark Turtles, and Shirelle inside a Triceraton android. It would also have brought the Turtles back to the present by the end of the season. However, Playmates wanted the Turtles back in the present, and with a style closer to the figures they were producing for the movie. Season 7, now known as Season X, had to be abandoned early in production, but some of its episodes and plots would be recycled for the actual 7th season. This was yet another sudden change that left the creative team with an empty programming slot to fill. Fortunately or not, they still had the 5th season waiting to be released, which helped them fill the gap between seasons. It was also during this time that a crossover between the 2003 and 1987 Turtles was finally approved, and the team started working in the background to make it a reality for the 25th anniversary. While this was a suggestion from Playmates so they could do something with the original toy line, the company decided not to fund the movie. This gave Mirage and 4Kids more creative control to do something that didn't need to sell toys. In other news, since the WB and UPN merged to form the CW, by late 2007, the CW announced its exit from kids' Saturday morning programming. With that slot open, 4Kids made a 5-year deal to handle the 7 to 12 block starting in September 2008. 4Kids would manage all national advertising and would share ad revenue with the CW. The latter's share would be applied against a guarantee 4Kids would pay the network. This meant that 4Kids was now running 2 competing blocks in network television. Despite major competition from other male action properties this year, the movie gave the Turtles a boost. Unfortunately, the mortgage crisis started affecting toy sales, and the boon didn't last. Overall, Playmates ended up in the red. This resulted in another year of negative growth for the toy industry overall, with sales down 2% compared to 2006. And if that wasn't enough to worry about, there was also a problem in 2007 when Mattel discovered that their Chinese manufacturer had been using paint with excessive levels of lead. This pressured Mattel to recall many toys from the shelves, and while this didn't have anything to do with Playmates, the company considered that low sales could have been caused by the general public's fear of toys produced in China. As I mentioned, the big star of the year was the movie line, which included April, Casey, Splinter, Max Winters, Karai, and many more, including some 2-packs with the Generals. They later released variants for the movie figures, including the Shredder, who was absent from the movie. Other movie releases included the Cowabunga Carl Party Van and a Monster Action Tower playset. Fast Forward also had its own line this year, with releases like Splinter, Cody, Serling, Torben Zix, Jammerhead, Viral, Shakanabo, the Dark Turtles, and of course, the Turtles themselves. Vehicles included the Hypershell and the Hover HQ. In the previous chapter of History in a Half Shell, I spoke about the role fans played in keeping the franchise alive during its darkest times. So, what were they up to in this decade? Well, let's go back to July 2001, when a site known as the Technodrome, which had been around since late 1999, launched its own forum. While it had a slow start, the forums eventually became the site's main identity, and by the time the cartoon came out, old fans, new fans, and Mirage and 4Kids staffers were all visiting and interacting through the forums. The site would eventually be upgraded in 2004, achieving the look and feel it has today. Fans who survived the internet era of web rings and free hosting servers remained as guardians of the franchise. This included superfans like Michelle Ivy, Toka, and Rosangelo, who became involved with the franchise in some capacity during this decade. Thanks to fans like Toka, the administrators of the Technodrome, Rosangelo, and Michael Vaughn, new generations can still find pieces of lost media that would have otherwise been gone with discontinued sites and pre-digitalization of print media. One particular Turtle fan found herself in a peculiar situation that turned her into one of the most famous shellheads in the United States. Michelle Ivy was already a superfan in the 90s, but when VH1's Totally Obsessed posted an ad on Craigslist seeking collectors, she replied, and the production paid her a visit in June 2004 for a 3-day shoot. Unfortunately, Totally Obsessed had a particular way of representing collectors, so the whole thing was edited with a sensationalistic vibe, even asking her to pretend that she ate pizza every day. Michelle's dad was quite smart, and he filmed the behind the scenes of the whole process, proving that it was all highly exaggerated for TV. A year later, Michelle acted as an uncredited script consultant for the CGI movie. She was asked to verify lore consistency, as they were interested in featuring things that had never been done before in the movies. According to Michelle, it's thanks to her that Raphael used his sai to break Leo's sword. Later, in 2007, Michelle would start her own YouTube channel, later titled Cowabunga Corner in 2010. There, Michelle posted many interviews and behind-the-scenes footage, including a visit to the set of The Next Mutation, and of course, Totally Obsessed. In 2008, a writer by the name of Mark Pellegrini was let go from his writing job. So to continue writing every day, he decided to start a blog titled TMNT Entity. His blog is to this day one of the most popular sources of comic book reviews and fan-researched reading order lists. Mark would also play his part as a guardian of the franchise by recovering lost media, like the Japanese manga books he helped translate and publish online. He also collaborated with superfan Andrew Modine and Turtles Club's Arseny Dubakov on many fan-made projects, including the recovery and translation of lost media from all over the world. Finally, in 2009, Stephen Reese from the TurtleVan.com created GoGreenMachine.org with other TMNT fans as a collaborative blog project. The site is still there, and Toka is one of its contributors. Two video game companies held the rights for TMNT during this decade. One of them was Konami, who was responsible for some of the most popular TMNT games in history. But that was in the 90s. In 2003, Konami developed a beat-em-up based on the show, which came out in October with the idea of turning it into a great Christmas present. They also released a version for the Game Boy Advance. The game followed the events of the first season and was released for the GameCube, PlayStation 2, Xbox, and Windows. Despite the mixed reviews, the game received a sequel in 2004 titled Battle Nexus. It was based on the plot of the second season, this time supporting up to 4 players. Interestingly, the game included the original arcade game as an unlockable. It also received a Game Boy Advance side-scroller version. While it wasn't particularly groundbreaking, the game was successful for Konami, selling 1.48 million copies worldwide. This represented an overall increase in sales compared to the previous year. By 2005, Konami had a winning formula, so they released a third game based on the cartoon called Mutant Nightmare. It followed the events from the third season, so it included characters like Agent Bishop, Ultimate Draco, and the Triceratons. Similar to the previous game, Mutant Nightmare included Turtles in Time as an unlockable. The game was successful enough, selling approximately 1.5 million copies. It also received a Nintendo DS port. That same year, Konami released Mutant Melee, which wasn't based on any particular plot from the show. Instead, the player could pick up to 22 unlockable characters to use in 4 play modes. This one wasn't well received. Unfortunately for Konami, their TMNT license expired in 2005 and wasn't renewed. Curiously, Tech2Go and WayForward Technologies created joystick plug-and-play TV games that you could hook up to a TV. Some of these games were Battle for the City, Mutant and Monster Mayhem, and The Way of the Warrior. These games were an interesting trend of the 2000s. With Konami out of the picture, Ubisoft picked up the license. At the time, Ubisoft was known for their high production values and cinematic looks. Of significant importance was Ubisoft's ability to produce high-quality movie tie-in games, which was probably why they landed the license. In 2007, they produced the game for the movie for Xbox 360, Wii, PlayStation 2, PlayStation Portable, Nintendo DS, GameCube, and Windows. It sold 1.1 million units across 8 platforms. The game followed the plot of the movie, but it also allowed players to do acrobatics with the turtles and explore parts of the world. It received mixed reviews, but it was pretty addictive. They also developed a side-scrolling beat-em-up for the Game Boy Advance, which received very positive reviews. And speaking of odd formats and trends, an additional Windows game was packaged with the action figures in 2007, titled TMNT Ninja Adventures. Ubisoft would release more games for the franchise in this period, but I'll cover those later in this video. Overall, since 2003, Konami and Ubisoft have sold over 4 million Turtle video games. After a year without new chapters, Volume 4 returned with issue number 29, this time in digital format, for free. It would later get a limited run of 1,000 copies. Apart from the low demand for the book, this change was due to Peter's frustrations with Diamond, the comics distributor. He realized that preparing solicitations 4 months in advance, with ads, was becoming tiresome to him. While this was fine for other publishers, Peter couldn't cope with it, given the cost and the book's bi-monthly nature. He was also frustrated by the long wait between the book's printing and its reaching the reader's hands. So his new publishing strategy was this. He would release the book first as a digital PDF on Wowio.com and in a lower resolution on NinjaTurtles.com, all for free. For those who really wanted a physical copy, they could order one through Mirage's mail order at $10 plus shipping, with the first 100 copies including a black and white sketch on the inside front or back cover. This high price was set so that they could afford the printing costs. This meant that the book was probably not profitable despite its price. With all these changes, Peter hoped that working on the book would be fun again. Tales of the TMNT, however, continued its distribution system as usual. Now with Dan Berger as editor, the Turtles teamed up with one of his characters, Gutwallow, the gingerbread man, on issue number 51. The Turtles also had another team up with the Wild West Cowboys of Moo Mesa in the following issue. Last but not least, superfan artist and historian Toka provided a pinup for issue number 48. Tales had another spin-off miniseries this year titled Michelangelo the Third Kind, which dealt with the xenophobia that resulted from the Outram arrival on Earth. The story, produced by Jim Lawson and Eric Talbot, was a sci-fi take on what was going on in the United States at the time. As licensing arrangements mushroomed to include 80 US and 200 international companies, the franchise also hit another surprising milestone this year. Peter Laird bought all of Kevin's rights, title, and interest in the Turtles, as well as Kevin's income participation in March 2008, becoming the sole owner of the franchise. In the public announcement, Kevin assured that the Turtles were in excellent hands and that he was going to seek other artistic callings. But don't worry, there's still plenty of Kevin Eastman in the following chapters of History in a Half Shell. Starting with the cancelled second season of Fast Forward, the production team went digital, abandoning paper. This meant that the official 8th season would be the only one produced with a digital pipeline. The Lost season was finally aired this year, providing fans with the long-awaited conclusion to the arcs of the first 4 seasons. Since Playmates wanted another reset in setting and style for the show, all partners involved need to agree on the new direction. Many sub-brandings and concepts were discussed. One was codenamed Superworld, and it would have had something to do with a card game the Turtles would have used. Another pitch was TMNT Overload, and it would have featured our Turtles teaming up with their younger selves in the present. Their enemy would have resided in the virtual world, most likely Viral or the Cyber Shredder. To Peter, having 2 versions of each character felt redundant, and while there were some successful cases, kids were usually not inspired by other kids. It also went against Peter's restrictions on adding more Turtles that could make the original 4 less unique. Playmates made one pitch titled Ultimate TMNT, which would have blended multiple universes into one new reboot, settling for the aesthetics of the 2007 movie. This pitch was rejected, leading the way for the winning concept, Back to the Sewer. Hoping that brand synergy would make kids buy action figures based on the movie and the show's style guide was updated to align the Turtles and supporting characters more closely with the movie designs. As a result, after 6 seasons, the Turtles suddenly got pupils. If you're wondering why 4 kids in Mirage considered Playmates requests so much, you'll have to remember that in a post-cable world, cartoons weren't made to sell toys anymore. Toys and merchandising were made to keep cartoons in the air. With the abundance of kids' channels, advertising money wasn't enough anymore. Of course, Playmates still needed the cross-marketing to sell toys, so they needed each other. Back to the Sewer had Matt Dreck as showrunner, with Roy Burdine, Adrian Barrios, Edwin T. Nebris, and Carrie Randolph in charge of character development. With Dancing Diablo out of the picture, color supervision went to Reggie Butler, and Emilio Lopez stayed with the show as character and prop colorist. A new theme song was created by Russell Velasquez, which, depending on your preference, was probably the best of all seasons. Back to the Sewer aired from September 2008 to February 2009 and introduced Master Khan and a new iteration of the Shredder known as Cyber Shredder, which already existed in the franchise. Interestingly, it technically introduced the first iteration of Spider Bites, although the character wasn't named on the show. But the tide was changing for 4Kids. After striking that deal with the CW 4Kids was launched in September 2008. The 4Kids deal with Fox was due to expire in September 2009, so the deal with the CW caused some legal headaches for both Fox and 4Kids, leading to an early end to their agreement, which ended on December 31st, 2008. This settlement was favorable for both companies, as 4Kids' financial obligations with Fox also ended in 2008, allowing them to focus their resources on the 5-hour block on the CW. According to 4Kids, net revenues for the 3 months ending in September 2008 totaled $17.8 million, compared to $12.2 million for the same period in 2007. With 4Kids out of Fox, the network replaced the block with infomercials, ending its Saturday morning kids programming. But instead of bringing hope about the future, the deal with the CW was tainted by the mortgage crisis. In the last quarter, net loss totaled $19.6 million, an increase of $16.8 million from the previous year. The sharp economic downturn and the deterioration of consumer confidence made the last quarter of 2008 a nightmare, which also impacted licensing revenue. 4Kids was looking to cut costs, and by the end of the year, they announced they were laying off about 15% of their workforce. Add to all these troubles that 4Kids didn't renew its Pokemon license and were relying heavily on Turtles, Yu-Gi-Oh!, and on developing their own IP. With all the financial drama and the future of the show in jeopardy, the team moved on to the next Turtle project, the 25th Anniversary Extravaganza. The TV movie was announced this year, but details were kept to a minimum. Overall, fans knew that it would consist of 3 episodes with the possibility of a DVD release. The movie entered production by the middle of the year, and by October, Lloyd Goldfine gave it a proper title, Turtles Forever. There was only one more episode released after the finale. Mayhem from Mutant Island was a bite-sized saga released from March to May 2009 as mini episodes on the 4Kids site and later on TV. And that would end up being the final new episode ever produced for this iteration of the franchise. Despite the economic downturn, this toy line, launched in 2003, had sold 35 million action figures worldwide across 50 countries by 2008. But the economy was a major problem, and the retailer consolidation finally put KB Toys out of business. Among the variants released by Playmates this year were many Mini-Mutants. Adult collectors got a taste of NECA for the first time with their San Diego 4-pack release of the Mirage Turtles. Since this was a licensing agreement between Mirage and NECA, the designs had to be comic accurate and not exhibit any cartoon characteristics. To avoid competition with Playmates, NECA could only sell these figures in specialized stores, and they couldn't compete for the same audience. Despite the novelty, these turtles weren't selling well at the time, and it's usually considered that this release was ahead of its time. They were sculpted by the Four Horsemen, and they had a limited release variant in black and white. One additional issue of Volume 4 came out in 2009. Issue number 31 would be ready in 2009, but for various reasons would remain unprinted until 2015. In his blog, Peter promised that he could wrap up the storylines in more or less 6 issues. In the Tales book, the 2003 universe continued inspiring changes, with the adaptation of Hun finally revealing the secret origin of Casey Jones. Another significant event this year was the introduction of the Turtleverse in the pages of Tales of the TMNT number 58, during the final team-up with the Wild West Cowboys of Moo Mesa. While the project for Turtles Forever was around for a couple of years by now, the timing of the releases meant that the possibility of visiting other iterations was introduced first in the comics. 2009 was the year of the franchise's 25th anniversary, and one that fans would never forget. It started with a chance to win cool stuff in an online sweepstakes, including a limited edition bronze statue and a trip for 2 to New York. The marketing company organizing the event was Peppercom. The Shellebration kicked off in February at New York Comic Con. Peppercom would let a filmmaker film footage for his documentary about the history of the TMNT. This filmmaker was Isaac Elliott Fisher, and this was the documentary that is now known as Turtle Power, the definitive history of TMNT. Driven by Isaac, with the help of his friends Randall Lobb and Mark Hussey, they started filming for their Canadian company, Definitive Film. After interviewing a few fans, they realized they'd need something more. So Isaac went to New York Comic Con to connect with Mirage Studios. Peppercom's help allowed Isaac to gain full access to the anniversary events. It was at the convention that he finally met Kevin Eastman, who would help him connect with many other notable figures in TMNT history. A TMNT party bus toured the country as a mobile turtle museum showcasing all things TMNT, including character appearances and martial arts demonstrations. Wherever the bus went, fans could take pictures with the turtles, play video games, or simply admire the collection. It made 50 stops across 10 cities. It made its first stop in New York on April 23rd to light the Empire State Building green. There was also a screening of the 1990 live-action film at the Tribeca Film Festival, with the cast and crew in attendance. It was also in April that Mirage announced a new live-action movie for 2011, retelling the origin and adapting the first few comics. It was to be produced by Scott Mednick and Galen Walker, and funded through Lightbox Production LLC. 4Kids Entertainment was going to act as the master licensor for the movie merchandising. Some ninja casting calls took place along the tour, with Ernie Reyes Jr. acting as judge for the chance to get a spot in the 2011 movie. Their second stop was in Philadelphia, where the Turtles went to a Phillies game and even got out on the field with the Philly Fanatic. The following stops were Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, Dallas, Denver, Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles. A new reprint of TMNT number 1 was released for Free Comic Book Day in a proper comic book format. The last stop of the tour was at San Diego Comic-Con on July 23rd. There was a little bit of everything for Turtle fans: upcoming video games, a Mirage panel, and the premiere of the Turtles Forever movie. Interestingly, given the amount of time Peter and Lloyd Goldfine had been collaborating on the show up to this point, it was very likely the longest and most consistent working relationship Peter had ever had. Perhaps even more than the time he collaborated with Kevin. Meanwhile, the live-action movie found its writer, John Fusco. He would end up writing a much darker origin story, inspired by the recent success of The Dark Knight and Batman Begins. All 4 movies were re-released in a collector's edition on DVD and Blu-ray. After many comings and goings, the cancelled Archie Forever War saga was going to be published in 3 issues in November and December. To bring readers up to speed, a trade paperback titled Future Tense was published in July, collecting the Future Shark trilogy and the Dreamland story arcs. Unfortunately, the process to get the Forever War going was so slow that it was unlikely to come out during the anniversary year. Another project that would never see the light of day was a Mirage Universe sourcebook. This project was going to bring some order to what was canon and what wasn't. Writer Tristan Jones was involved in verification, confirming all events and bios. It was going to be about 160 to 180 pages long, and it would have been a flip book, one half about the good guys and the other half about the antagonists. Other writers involved were Steve Murphy and Jake Black. A final 4-issue spin-off Donatello miniseries was published by the end of the year by Jim Lawson and Eric Talbot. The Brain Thief explored Donatello's morality as he teamed up with a captive Baxter Stockman. On the Kevin Eastman side, Heavy Metal published TMNT 25th, a quarter-century celebration, collecting some of Kevin's favorite Mirage stories. It had a limited print run of 500 copies. Inspired by Super Smash Bros., Ubisoft released TMNT Smash Up. The brawler contained cutscenes written by Peter Laird and a pack-in comic written by Laird with Matt Lunig, with art by Jim Lawson and Eric Talbot. It was developed by Game Arts, published by Ubisoft, and released for the Wii and PlayStation. The game kept the same style as the 2007 movie, but added other characters, such as the Fugitoid and the Ultraminator. Ubisoft also released Turtles in Time Reshelled, which was an enhanced remake of the 1991 arcade game. It was digitally released for PlayStation and Xbox 360. The game was a commercial success, but eventually disappeared from the online stores after the license expired. Ubisoft also released TMNT Arcade Attack for Nintendo DS. This side-scrolling beat-em-up game was a tribute to the arcade games of the early 90s. It was released for the holiday season, but fans could play the game early by visiting the Party Bus in Seattle at the beginning of September. The Turtles had a good year. Playmates, not so much. Without new episodes or theatrical releases, TMNT action figure sales declined compared to 2008. Playmates reissued figures from the 1988 line, along with other collectibles like the Turtle Party Wagon and a metallized, non-articulated Fugitoid. Other releases this year included more Mini-Mutants. There were plans to release Mirage Turtles figures through Playmates, but these plans were aborted after the breaking news in October. And speaking of Mirage, NECA released in April that came bundled with Mousers as a San Diego exclusive. As I mentioned earlier, Turtles Forever premiered in the United States at San Diego Comic-Con. Since the film was a team-up with the 1987 Turtles, a special deal had to be made to allow characters and designs from the Fred Wolf cartoon to appear in the movie. The movie was the first animated project to use the Turtleverse, and the first to animate the original Mirage Turtles. Given the production's budget constraints, they couldn't bring back the original cast from the 1987 show, because they'd have needed to pay them union salaries, and the 2003 show was non-union. They also couldn't use the original music, as the licensor wasn't very cooperative. As a result, they ended up using sound-alike music. Both Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird had lines in the movie as themselves, even though they were played by actors. The show's sudden cancellation during production gave the movie a new purpose. The team realized this would be their swan song, so it needed to end with a big bang. Unfortunately, the team started getting laid off bit by bit until only a few remained during post-production. Some of them, knowing this was going to be the last chapter, finished the movie after getting fired, unpaid, and working overtime. The movie was finished just before Comic-Con, where it premiered. It was eventually broadcast as 3 episodes, and also as a TV movie on the CW network on November 21st, 2009. After 9 years away from the franchise, it was ironic that the next chapter would kick off with the help of Surge Licensing's Mark Friedman. He was surprised to be contacted by Nickelodeon as an advisor. They were interested in acquiring the TMNT franchise. It turned out that Nickelodeon wasn't strong among boys aged 6 to 11. It had been falling in this demographic by almost 10%, and 6% in the 9 to 14-year-old category. Rivals included Disney's new cable network Disney XD and Time Warner's Cartoon Network, Both had programming aimed at boys and young teens. So, the purchase of the franchise would bring action-adventure into their programming, something they were going to need, because Disney had just acquired Marvel Comics in a $4 billion deal. While its 25-year history didn't guarantee success, it was already an established juggernaut in that demo, and a better investment than starting from scratch. And thanks to Peter's efforts during this revival era, the brand became a classic, and proved it wasn't just a fad. There was also an additional incentive to purchase the Turtles. The original Shellheads were now becoming parents who would likely introduce the franchise to their kids. Mark arranged a deal between Peter Laird and Nickelodeon. After a decade of telling the stories he wanted to tell and creating the ultimate mass-market entertainment version of the franchise, Peter decided it was time to move on. Sure, if Peter was burned out and needed to leave the franchise to someone else, he could have kept the IP with Mirage Studios. But Peter felt that as long as he had a say in the franchise, he wouldn't be able to disengage from his creation. His hope was that with the franchise out of his hands, he would find some time and energy to draw again. However, he ensured he retained the right to produce up to 18 comics a year with the Turtles, without Nickelodeon's approval. But no longer than 48 pages. This could have been enough to keep the two books running and give him a possibility to return to his creation. This clause gave Peter enough peace of mind to let the Turtles go, and would allow him to finish Volume 4. From a historical perspective, given how Turtlemania peaked and declined, this was probably the right time in the cycle to sell the franchise. But this was a huge deal, and to go smoothly, it needed to be kept secret, even from the Mirage staff. On October 13th, Steve Murphy heard it first from a friend at the 4Kids offices. He sat on the information for a couple of hours until the whole staff was called into a meeting. 4Kids tried to buy the TMNT license from Laird before Viacom's acquisition to keep the company afloat. 4Kids knew in advance that change was coming. They knew it was going to be the end of the show, but they didn't think they'd be out of a job before the end of the movie's post-production. Acquiring the franchise was a big ordeal. Many contracts had to be signed to make it happen. Some characters had to be bought outright from their creators, which was yet another hit for Murphy, who was planning to buy back the rights to Ninjara and Jaguar. After realizing that was impossible, the whole situation left another bad taste in his mouth. He felt the entire 25th anniversary campaign was explicitly done to boost the franchise's value. After many months of negotiations with Viacom, Nickelodeon finally acquired the franchise on October 21st for $60 million. $10 million was used to buy out 4Kids' remaining TV rights, and $50 million went to Mirage, mostly paid to Peter. With the franchise in their hands, they announced a TV show for 2012. By October 28th, Playmates Toys secured master global toy rights for TMNT with Nickelodeon. While they had generated $2 billion at retail up to this point, the next 2 years would prove challenging without any TMNT releases. They'd need to spend time working with other brands and preparing for a 2012 relaunch of the line. Details about what Nickelodeon bought are not properly documented. They acquired the global rights to the franchise from Mirage Studios and 4Kids, giving them access to the IP and the rights to produce shows and films featuring the Turtles. This meant that Nickelodeon had instant access to the 2003 show and the Mirage comics, but other licensed material would probably need some clearings before being used. Things that were very likely beyond Nickelodeon's reach were the Next Mutation show and the movies, as these were not wholly owned by Mirage or 4Kids. Since Nickelodeon was interested in creating their own show and movie, getting the broadcasting rights to the Fred Wolf show and the movies would need to wait. As you can imagine, things started slowing down notoriously in 2010. Tales of the TMNT ended its run with issue number 70, just 2 issues short of catching up with the longest-running TMNT comic. Many of the arcs introduced in the book were left unfinished, and many stories unpublished, including one pitched by Sophie Campbell and the Gang War saga. Since Forever War and the Mirage sourcebook were nowhere near completion, they were cancelled. Projects had to be frozen for a few months to give the new owner time to consider them. As a result, creators found themselves unable to discuss their plans for a year. Nickelodeon considered relaunching the comic through Dark Horse Comics, with Sophie Campbell as the artist. Since she was under an NDA, she couldn't speak about it, and then Nickelodeon decided to go with another publisher. Interestingly, Tales artists like Sophie, Dario, and Tristan would end up making the jump into the IDW iteration. Despite his retirement, Peter was finally able to release issue number 31 of Volume 4, albeit in digital only. It wouldn't be printed in physical form until 2015. The live-action movie was in such an early stage that it simply changed hands. Writers Art Markham and Matt Holloway were brought in to co-write the script with Fusco. But Paramount wasn't happy with the edginess of the script, and that was when Michael Bay's Platinum Dunes got involved with the project to produce. The movie's release was postponed to 2012, and the new writers, Josh Applebaum and Andre Nemec, began work on a new screenplay. This is the Blue Door script that leaked later. I'll talk more about this in the next chapter. The Turtle Power documentary was supposed to have a December 2009 release, but after the sale of the franchise, it was delayed for 3 years for many reasons, among which was the hope to get a distribution deal with Paramount. Mirage Studios remained dormant for pretty much a decade. After the dust settled, it consisted of Peter, Gary, Dan Berger, and Katie McInnes. Peter let Jim Lawson and Michael Dooney continue to use the studio for their own projects. Dan and Katie worked on mail, selling overstock, and doing the books. According to Jim, Peter went out of his way to provide for everyone involved. NinjaTurtles.com was shut down by Nickelodeon. As a replacement, Mirage created MirageLicensing.com. Dan Berger started working for Heavy Metal magazine until 2020. He would later return to Heavy Metal and would continue doing Ninja Turtles art from time to time. Michael Dooney continued working and doing commissions and the occasional work for the Turtles, including the toys. Jim Lawson also continued working on his own projects and commissions, collaborating with the franchise from time to time. Steve Levine continued doing commissions, conventions, covers, and even opened shellback artworks from 2012 to 2020. It was a gallery and store featuring TMNT and indie comics artwork. Ryan Brown continued working with the Turtles from time to time, and he recently sold the Wild West Cowboys of Moo Mesa to the Nacelle Company. Steve Murphy moved on to writing novels and teaching graphic novel writing at community colleges. Eric Talbot continued making illustrations and covers for the Turtles, but he also decided to step out of his comfort zone, and he's been doing tattoos for a while in East Hampton, Massachusetts. Not so unusual, considering he created Tattoo. AC Farley still does commissions, and he's working on 2 books. One focused on his art, and the long-awaited Recombatants graphic novel. The 4 Kids cartoon went off the air in August 2010. After that, Nickelodeon unlocked the rerun rights to the show, airing it on Nicktoons until 2018. Lionsgate owned the distribution rights to the Fred Wolf cartoon at the time, which were not part of the acquisition, so Nickelodeon couldn't broadcast it. As for the CW 4 Kids block after the Turtles, it was rebranded Toonzai, changing its focus to anime. But sadly, by then, the Saturday morning model was pretty much dead. 4 Kids continued having multiple lawsuits from TV Tokyo and ADK over Yu-Gi-Oh! Licensing. They were accused of fraud and breaches of contract, and they eventually filed for bankruptcy in 2011. By 2012, 4 Kids and Yu-Gi-Oh! Licensing settled their disputes. 4 Kids emerged from bankruptcy as 4 Licensing Corporation, before entering another bankruptcy in 2016. Toonzai was replaced by Vortex, run by Saban Brands, who repurchased the Power Rangers from Disney. Vortex ran from 2012 to 2014, and served as an ironic bookend to this story, as all of this started with the vacuum left by Saban. One special note should be made about the next mutation. Its broadcast rights also went back to Saban Brands, and would later be part of the sale to Hasbro in 2018. Because of this, the show is off limits to Nickelodeon. Ownership of the characters, however, seems to be in some sort of gray area. As for the Turtles, after 25 years as an indie creation, they were finally adopted by a big corporation, and no longer had to prove themselves to publishers, film studios, and toy manufacturers. The Turtles had become an evergreen classic. After hearing about the franchise sale, animation director Ciro Nieli pitched his take on the Turtles to Nickelodeon, and it would be the beginning of a new era for the franchise. IDW Publishing would sign a deal to bring the Turtles back to comics in late 2010, and while one of the Turtles creators was entering retirement, the other one was just about to get his second chance. For all this and some alien Ninja Turtles, please join me in the next chapter of History in a Half Shell, where I'll cover the Ciro Nieli years of the Nickelodeon era. If you're still here, please leave a comment saying, "It's Ninja time," as well as your thoughts about this era of the franchise. Thanks for watching. See you in the sewers.